Hey guys, tonight we're looking at why medieval knights so often threw themselves into violent, reckless, seemingly unhinged extremes, along with a few other curious corners of history. To understand why some medieval knights occasionally behaved like men running a long-term study into the outer limits of human judgment, we have to go back to when they were small children. A knight was not forged on a battlefield, he was shaped in a nursery. If you happened to be born into a noble household in medieval Europe, much of your future was settled before you could string together a full sentence. A peasant's son might one day inherit a strip of land. A merchant's son might take over the family trade. A noble's son, however, was expected to grow into a warrior. Medieval society had very little patience for the news that your real calling was, say, pottery. Around the age of 7, a great many noble boys were sent away from home to serve as pages in the household of another lord. These days, a parent worries when a child spends too many hours on a screen. A medieval parent studied a 7-year-old and concluded, "Wonderful, he looks ready to start training for combat on horseback." A page's daily life meant lessons in courtesy, faith, reading, riding, hunting, and waiting on distinguished guests. On the surface it seemed perfectly refined. But underneath each lesson ran the same quiet message. Your value rested chiefly on how good a fighter you could become. Even play nudged boys in the same direction. Wooden swords were ordinary playthings. Pretend battles were welcomed. A talent for wrestling won approval. Meanwhile, anything that rewarded caution, patience, or steering clear of needless danger drew far less notice. Medieval Europe was not stumbling into producing knights by accident. It was running a strikingly efficient knight factory. The stories children heard did the same work. Young, noble boys were raised on tales of famous warriors who galloped headlong into hopeless situations and somehow came out draped in glory rather than regret. The knights of King Arthur, the champions of Charlemagne, and celebrated crusaders crowded their imaginations. Nobody gathered children around to spin a gripping yarn about Sir Geoffrey, the reasonably prepared, who weighed the risks with care and lived quietly into old age. Once they reached their teenage years, pages were promoted to squires. This was the stage where the training grew far more serious. Squires kept weapons in order, tended the horses, polished armor, and rode alongside knights on military campaigns. Many of them saw fighting, harsh punishments, raids, and battles while still remarkably young. For a squire, warfare was not some rare interruption. It was simply part of the everyday backdrop. At the same time, they came to understand that reputation was everything. A knight's honor shaped his friendships, his political weight, his marriage prospects, and the standing of his whole family. Being known as brave could swing doors open across a kingdom. Being branded a coward could trail a man for decades like an unusually persistent tax collector. The outcome was easy to predict. Young men learned that caution invited ridicule, boldness earned admiration. Recklessness, now and then, earned songs, and songs carried enormous weight. Because by the time a young nobleman was finally granted his spurs and made a knight, he had spent well over a decade soaking up one single lesson. Glory was worth almost any risk, as we'll soon see. Hand thousands of ambitious young men that conviction, then give them swords, war horses, and social rank, and you get precisely the sort of results anyone might expect, only with more chainmail. By the time a young man became a knight, he had already absorbed the idea that courage mattered. What came next was a good deal more dangerous. He learned that honor was everything. In the modern world, when someone insults you online, the usual advice is to ignore them, block them, or spend 3 seconds recognizing that their opinion changes nothing whatsoever about your life. A medieval knight would have found that approach thoroughly baffling. To a knight, honor was not merely a question of private pride, it functioned as a kind of social currency. It touched business dealings, political alliances, chances at marriage, positions of military command, and the prestige of the family name. Honor could open doors. Losing it could shut them just as fast. All of this produced a world in which even minor insults could turn surprisingly grave. Picture yourself at a feast where a fellow nobleman idly questions your courage. Perhaps he hints that you turned up late to a battle. Maybe he suggests another knight fought more bravely than you. Perhaps he simply lifts an eyebrow at an awkward moment. Today, most people would carry on with their evening. A medieval knight might devote the next 6 months to plotting revenge. The trouble was that honor lived largely in the opinions of others. If enough people accepted an accusation, it could harden into fact whether or not it was actually true. So knights felt a constant pressure to guard their reputations, and guard them they did. Quarrels regularly swelled into duels, feuds, or open warfare. Noble families sometimes battled one another for years over disputes that had started with an insult, a squabble over inheritance, or an imagined slight. Whole regions could slide into instability because 2 powerful men refused to concede that perhaps everybody involved was being unreasonable. Admitting fault was especially hard. A knight who backed down risked looking weak. A knight who raised the stakes could at least insist he was defending his honor. This built a curious system in which the most sensible solution was frequently the least appealing one. The culture applauded bold reactions and penalized restraint. As a result, a great many knights fell into the habit of treating every challenge as a test of character. A disagreement turned into a matter of honor. A contest turned into a matter of honor. Someone glancing at you the wrong way somehow became a matter of honor. Before long, honor had stopped being a virtue and become something more like a full-time occupation. And unfortunately, there was one place where knights could parade their honor before enormous crowds, win fame, collect prizes, and every so often get trampled by horses. It was called a tournament, and it proved to be one of the most effective methods ever devised for persuading young noblemen that reckless behavior was a splendid idea. If honor was the fuel that drove the medieval knight, tournaments were the engine that burned through it at an alarming pace. On first hearing, a tournament sounds innocent enough. Modern people catch the word and picture organized contests, clear rules, medical staff on hand, and competitors heading home with a trophy and maybe a slightly twisted ankle. Medieval tournaments were a touch different. A fairer description might be large crowds of heavily armed noblemen assembling in a field to resolve absolutely nothing while gambling with their lives. To begin with, tournaments were not even meant as entertainment. They served as military training drills. Knights practiced riding, fighting, and cooperating under something close to battlefield conditions. The snag was that knights swiftly realized they liked the fighting far more than the practicing. Thousands of onlookers often turned up for these events. Nobles, merchants, peasants, clergy, and wandering travelers all gathered to watch. A successful knight could gather wealth, fame, and admiration. He could draw powerful allies to his side. He could climb in social standing. Some could even catch the eye of a possible marriage match. In short, tournaments made an ideal stage for showing off, and knights hardly ever needed a push in that direction. The most perilous events were called melees. Unlike the neatly staged jousts so often shown in films, a melee threw large groups of knights together to fight across open ground. Competitors charged one another with lances, swung swords, dragged rivals from their saddles, and tried to seize opponents for ransom. The whole thing echoed a real battle so closely that spectators now and then had trouble telling them apart. Injuries came often. Broken bones, crushed limbs, blows to the head, and fatal mishaps happened with grim regularity. Armour offered protection, but it could not entirely make up for the fact that dozens of armoured men were thundering toward each other carrying weapons. Strangely, that danger frequently made the tournament even more appealing. Knights won prestige by putting bravery on display. The bigger the risk, the bigger the possible glory. A careful knight might live through the day, yet he was unlikely to become famous. A reckless one might turn into a legend or a cautionary tale, sometimes both at once. Certain knights grew obsessed with tournament success. They journeyed all across Europe hunting for competitions, chasing victories the way modern athletes chase championships. Some poured vast fortunes into horses, armour, servants, and travel. A few bankrupted themselves entirely in the effort to protect their reputations. Because by this point, many knights had picked up a dangerous habit. They no longer merely wanted glory, they needed it. And that craving for recognition would soon trail after them well beyond the tournament field and into every corner of medieval life. By now, our medieval knight had spent years pursuing honour and proving himself in tournaments. Unfortunately, there was one catch. The proving never came to an end. A knight might win 10 battles, dominate 20 tournaments, and collect praise from kings, and yet a single moment of hesitation could still stain his reputation. Medieval society had many admirable traits, but it was not especially merciful about anything that looked like weakness. This set up a strange psychological trap. Knights were expected to be brave at all times, not occasionally, not only when the odds were good, but always. If a dangerous mission came up, a knight was expected to volunteer. If an enemy challenged him, he was expected to answer. If a battle looked lost, he was expected to charge into it regardless. The idea of saying this seems pointless and possibly fatal, rarely drew any applause. Many knights ended up caught in a cycle of endless performance. Every public appearance felt like an examination. Every choice was watched by peers only too keen to weigh up courage, loyalty, and strength. And medieval nobles judged one another without pause. A knight's companions might forgive a lost battle. They might forgive plain bad luck. What they found nearly impossible to forgive was any hint of fear. This helps explain some of the remarkably reckless decisions scattered throughout medieval history. Knights sometimes launched attacks against overwhelming odds because retreat felt shameful. Others accepted duels they had little hope of winning because turning them down could wound their standing. Some stayed in hopeless battles long after common sense had gathered its things and departed. The pressure grew especially fierce among younger knights. Older warriors had occasionally learned caution the hard way. Younger men usually still had something to prove. A seasoned knight might glance at a dangerous situation and think, "I have seen enough battlefields to know this is a terrible idea." A 20-year-old knight might look at the very same scene and think, "This could make me famous." History offers many examples of both mindsets. The second group tends to be remembered rather more often. Literature only made things worse. Stories glorified heroic last stands, impossible victories, and fearless warriors who never once doubted themselves. Real knights devoured these tales with enthusiasm. The fact that so many legendary heroes were entirely fictional did little to cool the urge to imitate them. After all, nobody composes epic poems about the nobleman who calmly sized up the situation, talked his way to a peaceful settlement, and came home with all his limbs still attached. The result was a culture in which seeming fearless became almost as important as actually staying alive. and when a whole class of warriors spends its life trying to prove it fears nothing, sooner or later some of them begin to believe it. That belief would grow more dangerous still once religion entered the picture and began promising rewards far greater than any earthly glory. If tournaments urged knights to gamble their lives for glory, religion held out something even more powerful. It held out eternal glory. For centuries, medieval Europe was profoundly shaped by Christianity. Knights went to church, sat through sermons, gave gifts to monasteries, and viewed much of life through a religious lens. Most sincerely believed that God took an active hand in human affairs. Then, in the closing years of the 11th century, a remarkable idea began to spread across Europe. What if fighting could actually help rescue your soul? Nowhere did that idea find a clearer voice than during the Crusades. In 1095, when Pope Urban II summoned an army to march toward the Holy Land, he framed the campaign as far more than warfare. He described it as a holy obligation. For the knightly class, this was something close to a transformation. Up to that moment, bloodshed had posed an uncomfortable dilemma. The faith placed enormous weight on peace, mercy, and modesty. Knights, on the other hand, made their living by striking people with sharpened metal. Squaring those two truths had never sat comfortably together. The Crusades appeared to dissolve the contradiction. All at once, a knight could do battle, strike down foes, collect honor, build renown, and perhaps secure a heavenly reward, all in a single effort. It was almost as though a religious cause had been custom-built to match the desires of well-armed noblemen. Predictably, plenty of them signed on eagerly. By the thousands, they sold estates, took on debts, and abandoned their households to march with the crusading forces. Some crossed thousands of miles through strange lands, facing sickness, empty stomachs, harsh weather, and threats at every turn. The road itself was often merciless. Whole bands died before they ever glimpsed their goal. Even so, many pressed on, convinced they were part of something holy. Faith certainly fueled that resolve, but so did the pull of status. Those who came home frequently returned with brighter reputations. Old campaigners were admired across the continent. People wanted to hear their accounts. Their experiences carried tremendous social weight. To an ambitious knight, the draw was plain enough. A tournament might win you renown in your own district. A crusade could spread your name throughout all of Christendom. Regrettably, this blend of belief, honor, and combat sometimes bred remarkable overconfidence. Some crusaders grew certain that divine favor promised them victory. Others read their triumphs as evidence that God endorsed every choice they made. A handful nursed hopes that reality was never likely to satisfy. Time and again the record showed that arrows, illness, thirst, and clumsy planning cared nothing for a man's self-assurance. Still the conviction endured, and once a knight was persuaded that both his fellow men and the heavens were urging him onward, restraint grew ever harder to defend. As we will see next, certain warriors grew so at home in conflict that they no longer required religion, honor, or tournaments to spur them on. They simply came to feel that peace itself was the trouble. For some medieval knights, war was a matter of survival. For others, it became a routine. And for a startling number, it resembled nothing so much as a pastime. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe held thousands of trained fighters whose whole sense of self was bound up in combat. They had passed their childhoods learning to fight, their youth rehearsing it, and their grown years earning rank through it. Then peace settled in. That produced an odd sort of difficulty. A knight with no war was rather like a fisherman with no water, or a baker with no flour. The abilities remained intact, yet the chances to apply them had vanished overnight. A good many found this hard to bear. A modern professional athlete might retire and take up golf. A medieval knight tended to scan the horizon for the closest quarrel. Writers of the age occasionally grumbled about this habit. When calm settled over the land, some knights grew fidgety. Raiding, feuding, private wars, and assorted armed troublemaking often multiplied whenever no large campaigns were on offer. The Church itself tried to tackle the matter. Efforts like the Peace of God and the Truce of God sought to curb violence by limiting when knights might fight and whom they were permitted to strike. In effect, church leaders found themselves pleading, "Please refrain from attacking people for at least a portion of each week." That such rules were thought necessary tells us a great deal. Some of the difficulty was financial. Keeping up a knight standing cost a fortune. Horses, armour, weapons, attendants and lands all demanded serious means. War sometimes opened the door to plunder, ransom payments, fresh territory, and political climbing. Fighting could turn a profit. The battlefield delivered danger, meaning, fellowship, and the chance to be noticed. It turned plain men into heroes, or at least offered them a shot at it. Set against that, overseeing lands and refereeing quarrels among tenants could feel astonishingly tedious. Picture training your whole life for grand feats of bravery, only to learn that your most pressing task is deciding who owns 3 goats and half a field. Not every knight made the shift with any grace. Some went hunting for adventure. Others enlisted in foreign wars. Many took up crusades in part because those offered a respectable channel for their martial urges. What emerged was a warrior class inclined to treat peace as an interruption rather than a prize. And that outlook grew especially hazardous once it met the constant rivalries of noble life. Because if any single thing could keep knights busy in peacetime, it was dreaming up fresh reasons to loathe their neighbours. When medieval knights could not find a war, they were usually quite able to manufacture one. And as a rule, they did not have to go far. The nearest foe was often a neighbouring lord. Modern quarrels between neighbours usually centre on fences, parking spots, or the odd argument over noise. Medieval noble quarrels involved armed retainers, torched villages, and enough shared loathing to keep several generations busy. A feud could spring up almost anywhere. A contested inheritance, a disputed boundary, a shattered marriage pact, an insult tossed out at a feast, a mishap while hunting, an unpaid debt, or simply 2 powerful men deciding they could not stand one another. Once underway, these quarrels had an unfortunate habit of swelling. The trouble was that medieval justice was frequently feeble, uneven, or bent by local muscle. If a knight felt himself wronged, he could not always trust the courts to set things right. So a great many nobles favoured a blunter method. That method generally meant assembling armed men. Before long, a clash between 2 individuals could balloon into a struggle, drawing in whole families. Allies lined up on either side. Old resentments came bubbling back. New ones took shape. Soon enough, nobody could quite recall how the feud had begun, yet everyone stayed firmly devoted to keeping it going. This was especially common among the mighty noble houses. One generation might light the fire. The next inherited it. Then their children inherited it in turn. In certain cases, people were gambling their lives over arguments that predated their own birth. Strangely, this often struck those involved as entirely sensible. Honor called for revenge. Revenge shielded reputation. Reputation shielded status. And status shielded everything else. The reasoning ran in a circle, yet it was wildly popular. Castles served a key purpose in these disputes. They were not merely dwellings, they were fortifications. A knight who felt cornered could withdraw behind heavy walls, stockpile provisions, and brace for a siege. This sometimes stretched a local squabble into a drawn-out military affair. Picture falling out with your neighbor and answering by sealing yourself inside a fortress while armed friends muster beyond the gates. Medieval Europe now and then ran on exactly this principle. Some knights grew so infamous for private warfare that even kings had trouble reining them in. Rulers issued command after command demanding peace, only to find that heavily armed nobles were curiously choosy about which orders they obeyed. The outcome was a countryside crowded with rivalries, grudges, and vendettas. And though these feuds often brought tremendous ruin, they also nudged knights towards seeing themselves as heroes in an unfolding drama. A drama that turned even more perilous once tales and legends persuaded certain warriors that they were meant to live like the champions of old. By the point our story has reached, our medieval knight has spent years guarding his honor, riding in tournaments, joining feuds, and chasing glory. Regrettably, one more influence was quietly molding how he saw the world. Stories. Great heaps of stories. Medieval Europe adored tales of gallant knights. Noble halls overflowed with poems, songs, romances, and legends praising larger-than-life fighters who accomplished the impossible and never seemed troubled by the ordinary limits of being human. Such stories offered daring heroes setting out on hazardous quests, overcoming wicked foes, saving noble ladies, and winning everlasting fame through valor and virtue. The tales made fine entertainment. The snag was that some knights began treating them as guidance for their careers. These days, most people can sit through an action film without instantly trying to leap between moving cars. Medieval knights did not always keep such a firm line between story and life. Plenty genuinely set out to copy the heroes they admired. Across Europe, noblemen borrowed the speech and manners of chivalric romance. They dedicated their victories to noble ladies, hunted for chances to make bold displays of courage, and eagerly chased adventures that echoed the tales they loved. Sometimes this did no harm. Sometimes it was thoroughly embarrassing. And once in a while, it was dangerous. One well-known instance came in the later Middle Ages, when knights took to undertaking elaborate quests purely to demonstrate their nerve. Some swore odd public vows. Others journeyed vast distances in search of a worthy opponent. A few knowingly placed themselves in needless peril, convinced that heroic deeds would polish their reputations. To modern eyes, this can look remarkably foolish. Yet through a knight's eyes, it held together perfectly. The heroes in the tales earned admiration. The living knights craved admiration. And so the answer seemed obvious. Become the tale. The catch was that real life offered few of the conveniences packed into heroic romance. Dragons rarely turned up. Wise wizards proved hard to track down. Prophecies could not be trusted. and enemies stubbornly declined to behave like supporting cast. Actual battles came with mud, sickness, weariness, and confusion. Real warfare seldom looked as graceful as the verses claimed. Even so, the fantasy kept its grip. Many knights pictured themselves not as mere soldiers, but as the leading figures in an epic tale. Each tournament turned into a trial, each feud turned into a quest, each battle turned into a chance at immortality. And when enough people come to believe they are the heroes of a grand narrative, something curious follows. They begin taking risks that sensible people would wisely sidestep. As we will soon find, nowhere did this prove more dangerous than in the Crusades, where some knights carried these dreams of heroism far past Europe's borders, and now and then far past reality as well. The Crusades drew some of the boldest knights in Europe. They also drew some of the most hopeful. And optimism, though generally counted a fine trait, can grow dangerous once you add armor, religious certainty, and a horse. By this stage, medieval knights had spent their entire lives absorbing one very particular lesson. Be brave. Be honorable. Chase glory. Never yield. And where possible, do all of it while an audience looks on. Now and then they prevailed and passed into legend. More commonly, they became cautionary tales. One of the best-known cases unfolded during the 100 Years' War between England and France. French knights were broadly counted among the finest fighters on the continent. They had superb armor, mighty horses, noble bloodlines, and complete faith in their own skill. Sadly, confidence sometimes proved less useful than arrows at engagements like Crécy and Agincourt. Heavily armoured French knights charged the English lines again and again in spite of awkward ground, poor visibility, and unmistakable signs that matters were going badly. The reasoning behind these assaults often held up within knightly culture. Retreat brought shame. Hesitation brought shame. Waiting sat suspiciously close to hesitation, and so charging ahead looked like the honourable path. That hundreds of longbowmen stood waiting up front somehow did nothing to improve the plan. Over and over, knights picked courage above caution. At times, single acts of bravery were truly stunning. Chroniclers told of knights fighting on after losing their horses, taking wounds, or finding themselves ringed by foes. Others turned down chances to pull back because they felt their reputation required them to hold their ground. From a modern vantage point, this can seem senseless. From a medieval knight's vantage point, reputation often outlasted the body, and many cared deeply about what would be said of them once they were gone. Stories spread across Europe, telling of fighters who had faced hopeless odds and refused to yield. Boys destined for knighthood came of age idolizing these tales, and it was only natural that they hungered for a legend of their own. The trouble was that each new generation held tight to the memory of the few extraordinary men who walked away from impossible moments, while quietly letting go of the far greater number who did not. Out of this grew a risky sort of hopefulness about the past. A young knight might absorb 10 shining accounts of glorious last stands, yet almost never encounter a careful record of the hundreds who tried the very same thing and met a swift, unforgiving answer. Legends stay with us. Statistics tend to slip away. And still, in spite of every catastrophe, loss, and hard lesson, plenty of knights kept chasing glory with a stubbornness that never wavered. Courage, after all, was only half the picture. Standing mattered as well. And nowhere was standing put on display so lavishly as in the peculiar, frequently absurd realm of knightly fashion. If the picture in your mind of a medieval knight is a no-nonsense soldier thinking of nothing but combat, the historical record offers some deflating news. A great many of them were preoccupied with fashion, not casually curious, preoccupied. That might sound odd for men who routinely stood a chance of meeting an axe, yet medieval knights placed tremendous value on how they looked. Garments, armor, mounts, banners, and personal emblems all broadcast one's standing. And in a world where standing was practically the whole of life, appearance turned into a matter of real weight. A knight's armor was never simply defense. It was a declaration made in public. The very best armor demanded rare craftsmanship to forge and vast riches to acquire. A splendid harness proclaimed that whoever wore it was mighty, accomplished, and worth noticing. It filled roughly the same role as a luxury car does today, though it performed considerably better in the middle of a cavalry charge. Rivalry was quick to follow. Knights adorned their helmets with intricate crests. They dressed in vivid colours under their steel. Shields carried the marks of the family line. Horses were draped in costly cloth stitched with heraldic patterns. Now and then the battlefield came to resemble a fashion showcase that had gone terribly astray. As riches multiplied across the High Middle Ages, the competition among the nobility grew sharper. Some knights took to sleeves so long they lost all usefulness. Others preferred shoes whose pointed toes stretched to ridiculous lengths. A handful of these fashions became so excessive that officials would occasionally try to rein them in through written law. When a government begins passing rules about the length of one's shoes, a fashion has most likely overshot every sensible boundary. Still, the reasoning behind such display was straightforward. Being seen bred prestige. Prestige bred sway. Sway opened doors. A knight who cut an impressive figure often drew notice before a single word left his mouth. Tournaments only fed this appetite. Such gatherings were never purely tests of arms. They were social occasions on a grand scale. Noble households assembled to watch, to weigh, and to size up the competitors. Every knight longed to be the one people remembered. So many poured fortunes into their gear and their look. Some took on heavy debt simply to keep up appearances. Others sank staggering amounts into horses, armor, clothing, and attendants. A few came close to ruining themselves in the effort to seem successful. The contradiction was hard to overlook. Knights loved to insist that courage, discipline, and virtue outranked all else. Yet a good number of them poured just as much effort into making sure everyone admired their wardrobe. Human nature, it appears, has shifted very little. Underneath all the armor, banners, and ornament lay a deeper matter. Knights did not merely crave respect, they craved glory. And that appetite for personal renown would in time drive certain warriors toward choices so heedless that even the people around them wondered whether honor had at last swallowed plain sense whole. By the closing centuries of the Middle Ages, many knights were no longer taking up arms, merely for land, for coin, or from obligation. They were fighting for something a good deal less practical. They were fighting to be remembered. Glory had always held a place in knightly life, but as the years passed it grew into something close to an obsession. Noble families toasted their heroic forebears. Poets sang of famous warriors. Chronicles set down their great feats. Songs kept their triumphs alive. The lesson was plain. A man might perish, but a name could endure. To knights with ambition, that was an intensely appealing thought. Medieval existence, after all, promised nothing. Illness, war, mishap, and political scheming could all cut a life short with no warning. Fame, on the other hand, held out a kind of immortality, at least on paper. And so a great many knights grew keenly interested in how those who came after would regard them. Would they be recalled as brave? As honourable? Would their names outlast their bodies by centuries? Such questions shaped no end of decisions. A careful triumph might win a military aim. A bold charge might win a spot in history. Sadly, the second choice usually looked the more tempting of the two. This held especially for younger nobles anxious to make a name. Many were convinced that only remarkable deeds could set them apart from the hundreds of other knights all reaching for the same recognition. Ordinary success earned respect. Spectacular success was never forgotten. The catch was that spectacular success and spectacular ruin tended to look nearly identical right up until the result was known. A knight who charged an enemy force and prevailed became a hero. A knight who charged an enemy force and fell became a cautionary tale. The choice itself was frequently one and the same. All across Europe, warriors made grand vows meant to prove their nerve. Some swore off certain foods until a military goal was met. Others pledged to set out on perilous journeys or to face fearsome rivals. These public promises drew every eye. They also made backing out awkward. Once a whole court had listened to your dramatic oath, reconsidering became a socially delicate business. No one cares to rise and declare that, upon reflection, they have settled on a safer and more sensible path. That is hardly the kind of announcement that gives rise to ballads. The chase after glory stirred up rivalry as well. Let one knight accomplish something remarkable, and the next felt driven to outdo it. Reputation turned into a contest with no visible finish line. There was forever another battle, another trial, another chance to prove oneself. And at times, in the frantic pursuit of fame, particular knights stepped over a line that even their fellow nobles found hard to overlook. For history holds no shortage of warriors whose conduct struck people as excessive, not only by the measures of our own day, but by medieval ones too. So far we have considered the culture that nudged knights toward recklessness. Now, it is worth meeting a few of the men who seized those ideas and carried them well past anything that could fairly be called ordinary. Because while medieval society did plenty to encourage extreme behaviour, some knights managed to stand apart even from their fellow fighters. And that is no small feat when your line of work already involves charging at people with lances. One well-known figure was the English knight Sir John Hawkwood. Far from the polished heroes of chivalric romance, Hawkwood passed much of his life as a hired sword. He campaigned up and down Italy, changed masters when it suited him, and earned a name as one of the most dreaded commanders of his era. To many nobles, loyalty was sacred. To Hawkwood, loyalty could apparently be discussed. His triumphs made him rich, but they also revealed just how far the world had drifted from the romantic ideals praised in knightly writing. The age of heroic warriors was steadily giving way to the age of professional soldiers. Then there was Sir Gilles de Rais of France. In the beginning his path looked remarkable. He served at the side of Joan of Arc and rose to become one of the most honoured nobles in the kingdom. But as time went on, his conduct grew ever more troubling and unstable. He burnt through immense wealth, chased strange ventures, and in the end became notorious for offences so terrible that they appalled the people of his own time. His ruin lingers as one of the darkest tales tied to the knightly class. Not every case was so bleak. Some knights merely carried astonishing reserves of self-assurance. Think of the many nobles who flung out dramatic challenges before battle, openly vowing victory against hopeless odds. Others roamed across Europe hunting for jewels and adventures, all in service of their name. A few grew so fixated on proving their courage that they seemed unable to notice danger at all. The chroniclers often admired such men. They also, at times, sounded worn out by them. Over and over, medieval writers described fighters who brushed aside advice, spurned caution, and pursued glory, heedless of what might come. Sometimes these men reached legendary heights. Sometimes they authored disasters. Often they managed both inside a single lifetime. What makes the story so gripping is that even medieval onlookers saw the trouble for what it was. Despite what many assume, people of the Middle Ages were not blind to recklessness. Chroniclers regularly took arrogant nobles to task, poked fun at foolish choices, and cautioned against runaway pride. They grasped something a good many knights struggled to accept. Courage and recklessness were not one and the same. The difficulty, of course, is drawing that line when an entire culture hands out rewards for dramatic behavior. And as Europe drew near the close of the medieval age, reality was preparing to teach a lesson that even the most obstinate knights could not shrug off. The battlefield itself was in the middle of a transformation. For hundreds of years, knights had ruled European warfare. They were the fighting elite. They held the finest gear, rode the best horses, and sat at the top of the social order. Had someone asked a medieval knight who would command the wars of the future, his reply would almost surely have been men precisely like himself. History, though, had arranged things otherwise. The earliest hints arrived well before the Middle Ages had run their course. On fields such as Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, ranks of English longbowmen tore into charging French knights again and again. The outcomes were profoundly unsettling. For generations, knights had trusted that courage, noble blood, and better equipment left them all but invincible. Then they learned that thousands of arrows had never been told as much. A peasant with a bow could now bring down a nobleman who had spent decades training for war. This was not the way the arrangement was meant to run. Yet the shifts kept coming. Foot soldiers mattered more and more. Professional fighters grew more common. Kings set about raising larger standing armies that leaned less on individual knights and more on discipline, organization, and supply. Nobody composes epic verse about supply wagons rolling in on time. Then came gunpowder. In its early days, the firearm was rough, unpredictable, and often as hazardous to the one holding it as to the foe. Many knights regarded it with plain scorn. That response was easy to understand. Picture devoting a whole lifetime to mastering the sword, the horse, and the arts of war, only to find that a farmer with a crude gun might undo it all from a comfortable distance. It felt unjust, because it was. The old order was slipping away. The battlefield increasingly favored coordination over lone bravery. A disciplined block of infantry could halt a cavalry charge. Cannon could bring down castle walls that had held for centuries. Firearms slowly stripped away the edge that costly armor had once provided. The knight's world was shifting faster than many knights could stomach. Some adjusted, others did not. A great many held fast to the ideals of chivalry long after the realities of war had moved off in another direction. They still reached for glory, personal honor, and dramatic shows of courage. The battlefield increasingly answered with arithmetic. More arrows, more gunpowder, more disciplined troops, and less romance. By the 16th century, the age of the knight was dimming. The warrior aristocracy that had governed Europe for centuries was gradually shedding its military weight. And perhaps the sharpest irony of all was this. The very culture that had urged knights to behave like heroes ran headlong into a new era that cared far less for heroics and far more for results. Which carries us to the last question. Were medieval knights genuinely mad? Or were they simply the product of a mad system? So, after everything we have wandered through this evening, we come to that final question. Were medieval knights genuinely mad? The answer is at once plainer and knottier than it first seems. Most knights were not out of their minds. They were not roaming their halls chatting with unseen dragons or trying to unhorse the furniture. By and large, they were capable people behaving exactly as their society expected them to behave. The real trouble lay in the world that had formed them. Long before Roman soldiers ever set foot on British soil, before arrow-straight roads sliced through the land and settlements rose where woodland had once stood, Britain sat at the very rim of the known world. To those living around the Mediterranean, the island carried an almost mythical weight. For generations, Greek traders had passed along tales they had heard about it. Sailors described faraway shores veiled in mist, unfamiliar tribes dwelling past the borders of any recognized kingdom, and a place where the ocean itself appeared to draw a line between the civilized world and everything unknown. Britain, of course, was no enchanted realm beyond the edge of the map. It was merely rather remote, rather damp, and now and then genuinely hard to locate through the fog. The land itself would have looked nothing like the Britain of today. Sprawling forests blanketed most of the terrain. Broad expanses of oak, ash and elm ran for mile after mile over gentle hills and river valleys. Wolves moved through the trees. Wild boar dug through the undergrowth. Deer travelled in great herds across open glades. Getting anywhere was slow and frequently wearing. No paved roads existed, no markers pointed the way, and there was certainly no obliging innkeeper stationed every few miles. Most travel traced the courses of rivers, old established trails, or plain footpaths pressed into the ground by countless feet and animals over many years. Weather touched almost everything about daily existence. Rain came often, and usually at awkward times, which was quite an achievement given that nearly every time was awkward for someone. Winters were wet and cheerless. Summers might be lovely one day and dreary the next. The climate asked for endurance from all who dwelled there. Even so, Britain was hardly deserted. Scattered across the island were dozens of tribes, each holding sway over its own patch of ground. Some settled the rich farmland of the south. Others made their homes among the mountains of Wales or the wilder country farther north. Each tribe kept its own chieftains, customs, alliances, and feuds. They shared threads of language and culture, yet they never regarded themselves as a single people. In any political sense, there was no Britain. There were only Britons. Little farming villages speckled the countryside. Hill forts sat atop high ridges. Merchants sailed across the sea bearing wares from mainland Europe. Farmers tended plots their families had worked for generations. Fighters watched over tribal lands and chased renown in battle. Seen from outside, the island felt remote and shrouded in mystery. To the people who actually lived there, it was simply the middle of everything. And for a very long stretch of time, that world stayed out of Rome's reach. But over the water, a rising republic was starting to turn its gaze north, and the long age of isolation was gradually drawing to a close. The Britain that stood before Rome arrived was not one kingdom, not a unified nation, and not even a loose gathering of agreeable neighbours who met from time to time to talk over shared worries across a good meal. It was a patchwork of tribes. Centuries before Julius Caesar had so much as heard the word Britain, successive waves of Celtic-speaking peoples had slowly spread themselves over the island. They did not come all together in one enormous migration. Rather, fresh groups, notions, technologies, and traditions trickled into Britain across the years, mingling with those already settled there. What emerged was a society both varied and abundant, sharing a great deal in the way of culture, yet remaining profoundly split. Every tribe held its own ground. The Catuvellauni commanded stretches of southeastern Britain, the Iceni governed lands to the east, the Brigantes controlled sweeping territories farther north. In the region now called Wales, several formidable tribes filled the mountains and the valleys. Beyond them lived peoples whom southern Britons often thought nearly as alien as anyone from over the sea. Where a person came from counted for a great deal. One was never simply a Briton. One belonged to a particular tribe, clan, family, and community. Devotion ran first to kin and to nearby leaders, rather than to any wider notion of a shared nation. When one tribe went to war with another, hardly anyone raised an eyebrow. Many, in truth, regarded it as entirely ordinary. Peace tended to be seen as a brief lull between quarrels. Most people lived in modest farming settlements dotted here and there across the land. Round houses raised from timber, wattle, and thatch stood at the heart of these communities. Households worked fields of barley and wheat, kept cattle and sheep, and laid away food for the hard months of winter. Existence turned with the seasons. Spring called for sowing. Summer meant grazing and repair. Autumn demanded the harvest and the readying of stores. Winter judged whether that readying had been enough. Nature had no patience for excuses. For all the weight placed on farming, tribal life was anything but plain. Talented metalworkers turned out striking weapons and ornaments. Craftspeople fashioned elaborate patterns that continue to astonish archaeologists to this day. Traders moved goods from one region to another, linking far-flung communities long before any formal roads were laid. Above the everyday farmers sat nobles, warriors, and influential families whose sway steered tribal affairs. Standing came from riches, from success in war, and from the knack of drawing followers. A well-regarded leader might have dozens or even hundreds of warriors at his call. A feeble one could soon find that loyalty vanished about as quickly as the gifts he handed out. These tribes would hold Britain for centuries. Yet even as they jostled among themselves, a far mightier power was steadily widening its reach across Europe, edging ever nearer to their coasts. As tribal numbers swelled and their rivalry sharpened, the face of Britain began to shift. Along hills and ridges, vast earthworks took shape. Great mounds of soil climbed up from the ground. Deep ditches were cut into the land. Wooden palisades topped defensive ramparts. From afar, these places resembled fortresses standing watch over whole districts. These were the hill forts of Iron Age Britain, and they ranked among the most remarkable structures raised anywhere in northern Europe before Rome came. To a modern observer, a hill fort might look like a plain military outpost. Defence, to be sure, mattered a great deal. A steep rise ringed with walls was far simpler to hold than a village sitting out in the open, waiting courteously for its attackers to turn up. But hill forts were a good deal more than forts. Many served as flourishing communities where hundreds, and sometimes thousands, of people lived and laboured. Within the walls stood roundhouses, storehouses, workshops, pens for animals, and open spaces where people gathered. Certain hill forts spread across dozens of acres, becoming lively hubs of tribal life. Picture drawing near to one on a busy day. Smoke drifts up from cooking fires. Smiths beat glowing iron into tools and blades. Farmers herd cattle through narrow gateways. Traders come laden with goods from distant places. Children dart between the houses while dogs bark at anything that stirs, which, to be fair, covered most things. The walls alone called for astonishing effort. With no machinery and no modern implements, these communities carved out enormous ditches using nothing but simple gear of wood and iron, along with sheer resolve. The earth lifted from those ditches was piled into looming banks. In certain places, several rings of defences encircled the settlement, obliging any attacker to fight through one barrier after another. Such building work stood for a vast outlay of time and labour. A hill fort was not simply somewhere to live. It was a declaration. It proclaimed the strength, the wealth, and the good order of the tribe that had raised it. Still, not every day was given over to preparing for battle. Most who lived there passed their hours at everyday work. Women and men ground grain, tended livestock, mended tools, cooked meals, and kept their homes in repair. Ordinary life stayed rooted in work, family, and getting by. The fort merely furnished safety and a sense of community. It also gave shelter in unsettled times. If raiders menaced the settlements nearby, people could fall back behind the earthworks. Livestock could be driven within. Stores could be safeguarded. The hill fort was as much a haven as a stronghold. And inside these walls, a further kind of power was quietly forming. For behind every great hill fort stood leaders who held command over its warriors, its wealth, and its people. Their authority would shape the fate of whole tribes. The hill forts of Britain did not raise themselves. Someone had to marshal the labour. Someone had to resolve arguments over land, guide warriors through conflict, and coax hundreds of people into working together on undertakings that might drag on for years. That burden generally landed on the tribal leaders. The Romans would in time name many of them kings, though the truth was often rather more tangled. These rulers were not kings in the later medieval mould. They did not perch on gilded thrones handing down orders to dutiful subjects. Their power leaned heavily on personal standing, on wealth, and on the loyalty of those who followed them. A tribal king ruled because people chose to follow him. And should they cease to follow, his position could turn remarkably short-lived. A capable leader needed several traits. He had to be a strong warrior, since military might stay essential in a world where neighbouring tribes might turn hostile with barely any warning. He needed a talent for diplomacy as well. Alliances sealed by marriage, agreements over trade, and negotiated settlements often proved every bit as valuable as triumphs on the field. Perhaps above all, a king needed generosity. Wealth was not meant to be locked away and hoarded. A leader earned prestige by giving it out. Fine weapons, livestock, jewelry, imported wares, and feasts all worked to firm up the loyalty of warriors and nobles alike. A chief who rewarded his followers freely could count on their support when trouble came. A chief who kept it all for himself tended to learn that loyalty had its limits. This was regrettable, though also instructive. The noble class sat in the tier just below the tribal rulers. These prominent families held land, wealth, and armed followers of their own. They counselled the leaders, saw to local matters, and jockeyed endlessly for rank. Politics in Iron Age Britain could grow surprisingly intricate. Friendships, rivalries, marriages, and long-held grudges swayed decisions just as much as practical concerns did, sometimes rather more. Powerful warriors made up another vital part of society. Young men in search of standing would often bind themselves to a respected leader. They fought in wars, stood guard over their chieftains, and looked to win riches and standing through deeds of courage. Tales of great feats spread from settlement to settlement. A fighter's name could roam much farther than the man himself ever would. All the while, common farmers kept the whole arrangement running by the sweat of their labour. Their grain, their animals, and their goods for barter supplied the wealth that let leaders hold sway and repay those who served them. Sitting at the heart of everything was the tribal king, who weighed his alliances, settled quarrels, and readied himself for troubles both close by and far off. For although political strength rested on loyalty, it leaned on something more besides. It required the blessing of powers older than any ruler, the gods, the spirits, and the holy customs kept safe by the Druids of Britain. While tribal kings bargained over alliances and warriors chased renown, the great majority of people in pre-Roman Britain led far plainer lives. They worked the soil. Indeed, almost everything in this society rested upon farming. However grand a chief's hill fort might look, prestige filled no bellies. Grain and animals stayed the bedrock of staying alive. An ordinary farming household dwelt in a roundhouse built from timber uprights, laced with branches and sealed with clay. Its roof was heavy thatch, which kept out the weather tolerably well, provided the weather chose to behave. Britain seldom offered such assurances. Within, a fire in the middle stayed lit nearly always. Smoke rose toward the roof, though a fair share of it lingered instead of leaving. The inside could be gloomy, hazy, and packed with people. A family would cook, eat, labour, and sleep all under the one roof. Livestock might be kept close by when the cold turned bitter. Solitude was not something Iron Age builders had in mind. The rhythm of most days followed the turning of the seasons. In spring, the ground was readied and the seed went in. Summer meant no end of tending both crops and beasts. Autumn delivered the all-important harvest. Winter put to the test whether the year's toil had counted for enough. Falling short brought grave results. A meagre harvest could bring want. 2 thin harvests in a row could put a whole community at risk. Unlike the shelves of a modern shop, ancient Britain gave people little chance to lodge a complaint with anyone in charge. Animals stood for wealth every bit as much as for food. Cattle mattered above all, and frequently marked a person's rank. Sheep gave the wool for clothing, and pigs yielded prized meat. Beasts called for endless care and shielding from sickness, thieving hands, and hunting predators. Still, farming was only one thread of the day's work. All across Britain, practiced craftsmen followed trades that took years to master. Smiths turned iron into tools, weapons, and goods for the home. Their craft could not be spared. Iron axes opened up the forests. Iron ploughs made the fields more productive. Iron spears helped settle arguments the old-fashioned way. Those who worked metal also fashioned lovely jewellery and ornaments. Elaborate torques, brooches, and trinkets showed off astonishing skill. A good many pieces that have lasted reveal a refined artistic tradition that took later Roman visitors by surprise. Weaving stood as another vital craft. Women frequently gave hour upon hour to turning wool into cloth. A single garment demanded tremendous work from beginning to end, which made every one of them worth keeping. Trade bound these communities to one another. Farmers traded away what they had to spare, craftsmen sold their wares, and merchants ferried goods between far-flung places. Life was hard, unchanging, and bound tightly to the whims of nature. And yet, underneath these everyday habits lay a deeper realm of belief and custom. To the people of Britain, the land itself seemed to hum with holy force, and no one grasped that force more fully than the Druids. For the people of pre-Roman Britain, there was no line drawn between the natural and the otherworldly. All of it hung together. Rivers, woods, hills, animals, even particular stones might carry spiritual meaning. The land was no mere backdrop for human living. It was a breathing part of what they believed, thick with unseen forces that shaped each day. Standing at the centre of this sacred world were the Druids. A great deal of what we know of them comes down to us from Roman authors, who tended to find Celtic ways fascinating, baffling, or now and then appalling. Because of that, telling truth from embellishment is no easy matter. The Romans excelled as builders and administrators, but they were not always the fairest witnesses when writing about someone else's religion. What does seem plain is that the Druids wielded tremendous influence. They served at once as priests, teachers, judges, keepers of history, and counselors. Within many tribes, their word carried further than a king's on certain questions. Where rulers commanded fighters and land, Druids kept watch over learning and tradition, and learning was power. Unlike later peoples who leaned so heavily on the written word, the folk of Britain held much of their past in memory and passed it down by mouth. Druids gave years to committing enormous stores of knowledge to memory. They took in laws, family lines, religious teaching, and tales handed down across the generations. The training might stretch across decades. It seems that becoming a Druid asked far more study than becoming a warrior, which may go some way toward explaining why more young men reached for the sword instead. Religious rites were often held under the open sky rather than within temples. Sacred groves counted for a great deal. Certain woods were held to be spots where the world of people and the world of the gods drew near. Rivers and lakes drew offerings too. Those who dig into the past have turned up weapons, jewelry, and treasured objects set down in water on purpose. These were no mishaps. Such things were gifts laid before unseen powers, given up in the hope of winning favour, safety, or good fortune. The wheel of the seasons moulded religious life as well. Festivals fell on the key moments of the farming year. Communities came together to mark a harvest, to greet the summer, or to brace for winter. These gatherings folded religion, company, feasting, and trade into occasions that firmed up the sense of who a tribe was. People looked to signs, rituals, and inherited belief for direction. Ahead of weighty choices, leaders would often turn to the Druids for counsel. Their blessing could lend a stamp of rightness to political moves and campaigns of war. In many ways, the Druids were part of what held society in one piece. But even as spiritual custom drew communities together, another current was quietly tying Britain to the wider world. Over the water, merchants were coming ashore with foreign wares, fresh ideas, and word from lands well past the horizon. For an island that supposedly sat at the very rim of the known world, pre-Roman Britain was remarkably well linked. The sea dividing Britain from the European mainland was no wall, it was a road. Long before any Roman army showed itself, merchants crossed the channel bearing goods, ideas, and stories between distant peoples. Each crossing carried fresh chances, fresh dangers, and every so often fresh confusion between people who shared no common tongue, yet shared a keen wish to turn a profit. Some things never change. Trade tied Britain into networks that spread over much of Europe. The island held resources that foreign merchants craved, tin above all. That metal was needed to make bronze, and Britain sat on some of the finest tin deposits in all of Europe. Cornwall grew especially prized. Tin dug there could journey hundreds of miles along the trading routes, reaching at last places most Britons would never lay eyes on. A scrap of metal pulled from a British hillside might pass through dozens of hands before it came to rest in a workshop somewhere near the Mediterranean. Other things sent abroad included livestock, animal hides, hunting hounds, wool, and quite possibly enslaved people. Though it sits uneasily with us today, slavery ran through much of the ancient world and made up part of many systems of trade. In exchange, foreign merchants brought luxuries. Fine pottery came from Gaul. Wine from the south of Europe turned up in the halls of well-off tribal leaders. Ornamental jewellery, glass beads, and skillfully worked metal found ready buyers among Britain's leading families. Goods from abroad carried prestige. A chief pouring Mediterranean wine at a feast was making a show of his wealth and standing. He was letting it be known that his ties reached well beyond the neighbouring tribes. Little impressed guests quite so much as sipping a costly imported drink while remarking on how great one's tribe had grown. Trade carried ideas along with it. Travellers from abroad brought word of far-off wars, mighty kingdoms, and clever new inventions. Britons heard of what was unfolding across Europe, while merchants from the continent carried tales of Britain home again. Ports and trading posts slowly turned into meeting grounds where differing cultures rubbed shoulders, tongues mingled, customs changed hands, alliances took shape. Now and then quarrels flared. People have always had a gift for pairing commerce with disagreement to striking effect. As riches grew, so did the rivalry. Holding the valuable trade routes brought power. A supply of foreign goods lifted one's prestige. Leaders who did well drew more followers and a wider reach. But plenty bred strain as well. The richer a tribe became, the more tempting a prize it made. Neighbouring communities kept a watchful eye on one another, and old grievances could turn bloody in short order. For beneath the trade deals and the diplomatic to and fro, Iron Age Britain was still a warrior society where conflict was never very far off. Trade brought wealth to Britain, but wealth tended to bring something else along with it. Envy. All over the island, tribes were forever contending for land, resources, prestige, and sway. Alliances came together and came apart. Friendships held until they grew inconvenient. Old grudges could outlast whole lifetimes, waiting patiently for a new pretext to flare up once more. War was a familiar thread in the fabric of life. This did not mean Britain sat in ceaseless turmoil. Most people passed their days farming, raising their children, and trying to outlast the weather. Yet clashes between tribes came around often enough that nearly every community understood how much warriors and defences mattered. A warrior who did well enjoyed no small standing. Courage on the field won respect, rewards, and stories that might be retold for years to come. Young men hungry for prestige often attached themselves to the following of a tribal leader, hoping to prove their worth through daring and skill. A name for fearlessness could open doors that riches on their own never could, assuming one lived long enough to enjoy it. Weapons differed from place to place across Britain. Spears were common and useful. Swords were tokens of status quite as much as instruments of war. Shields guarded warriors in a fight, and often bore elaborate patterns marking out tribal identities. Many a warrior carried gear that he or his family had spent considerable resources to acquire. Iron was precious. A warrior's arms stood not only for fighting strength but for social rank as well. One of the more singular marks of British warfare was the chariot. By the time the Romans arrived, chariots had all but vanished from the battlefields of the Mediterranean, yet some British tribes kept on using them. Roman onlookers were captivated. A warrior might ride into the fray aboard a light chariot handled by a deaf driver. At just the right instant, he would spring from it, fight on his feet, and then climb back aboard the moving chariot when he needed to. To Roman soldiers meeting this trick for the first time, it must have looked at once impressive and faintly absurd. The Britons, it seems, thought it entirely ordinary. Most fights were not enormous battles pitting whole nations against each other. Warfare more often took the form of raids, ambushes, cattle thefts, and small clashes between rival bands. Seizing livestock could count for as much as taking ground. In a farming society, driving off a herd of cattle could weaken an enemy while enriching your own tribe. And yet, for all the danger a neighbouring tribe might pose, a far greater one was taking shape across the Channel. The Roman Republic had swallowed up vast lands throughout Europe. Its armies grew mightier with every passing year. Before long, Britain would cease to be merely a far-off island at the world's edge. It would become a target. For hundreds of years, the tribes of Britain had lived beyond the grasp of the Mediterranean world's greatest powers. Empires climbed and crumbled far away to the south. Kings waged their wars. Cities swelled with riches. Armies tramped across whole continents. And Britain, meanwhile, stayed Britain. Its tribes traded with Europe, caught rumours from distant lands, and now and then took foreign merchants into their harbours. Yet for most people, Rome was little more than a name fixed to stories carried over the sea. That was starting to change. By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic had risen to be the leading power in Western Europe. Led by hungry generals, Roman armies overran vast territories. One after another, free peoples fell under Roman rule. Not every Viking fighter became a berserker. In truth, most did not. The men who won that dreaded name held a place all their own within Norse society. They were admired, feared, celebrated, and every so often steered clear of by the very people they defended. Stories told of them as fighters who seemed to change in battle, throwing off pain, caution, and at times all good sense along with it. But long before a fighter ever slipped into his first battle rage, he was nothing more than a boy coming of age somewhere in Scandinavia. There was little about his younger years that would have seemed remarkable. Home was a farm or a modest cluster of dwellings, hemmed in by dense woods, high ground, and frigid waters. Practical skills came to him early because survival demanded them. He tended animals, brought in firewood, cast lines for fish, joined in the hunt, and laboured beside his kin. Idleness had almost no place in this world. The northern climate was unforgiving toward anyone who failed to prepare, and winter returned each year as reliably as a debt that always comes due. So children grasped, without needing to be told, that toughness and stamina were worth having. Boys passed hour after hour in the open air. They scrambled up stony hillsides, waded through freezing water, took to the boats, and tagged along with grown men on the hunt. All of this hardened the body, yet it drilled in something just as valuable, the ability to master oneself. A fighter who lost his head endangered everyone at his side. Once boys reached their teenage years, the training that mattered for war grew steadily more central. First they handled wooden weapons, then moved on to the genuine article. Spears, axes, shields, and knives turned into everyday companions. Bouts of wrestling put both strength and stubbornness to the test. Contests among the young helped reveal which of them carried an unusual measure of nerve or ferocity. A few stood apart from the rest. Some seemed remarkably ready to walk toward danger. Others appeared almost pulled toward a fight. They showed no fear on the hunt, held firm through hardship, and brought a strange fierceness to any rivalry with those their own age. Qualities like these did not go unseen. In a world that prized its warriors, such youths tended to build a name well before they were grown. The old watched them closely. Local chieftains took note. Accounts of what they had done travelled from one settlement to the next. At the same time, the Norse looked upon warfare in a way that differs from how many people regard it now. Bravery was not merely praised, it was taken for granted. Honour, standing and courage were the very ground on which a man's place in the community rested. But for a handful, plain courage fell short. They reached for something larger and something shadier. As they came into their strength, particular warriors grew tied to potent beliefs surrounding Odin, the god who presided over wisdom, war, death, and the hidden currents that steered the destinies of men. And it was by way of Odin that the road of the berserker genuinely opened. When a young Norseman gave signs of becoming a capable fighter one day, his schooling happened in no dedicated hall of arms. It happened all around him. The farm, the woods, the fishing vessel, the hunting path, and the mead hall were each a lesson in themselves. Norse life turned on survival, and survival called for strength, ability, and grit. Every chore readied a young man for the trials adulthood would bring. Whether or not a boy meant to become a berserker, by his early teens he was counted on to pull real weight in his household. His days might be filled with felling trees, mending fences, minding the herds, or lending hands to the building of boats. Work of this kind rewarded staying power rather than short, sharp effort. No one hung up encouraging words to spur the boys along. There was only labour that had to happen. And when it did not, the whole household felt the lack. Even so, bodily power on its own did not suffice. A warrior in the making also needed a hardened mind. Life in Scandinavia routinely put a person's tolerance for discomfort to the test. Bitter cold, storms, thin harvests, and perilous journeys were ordinary facts. Grumbling changed almost nothing. The snow paid no mind to anyone's mood, and the North Sea cared even less. Young men came to treat hardship as simply part of being alive. Hunting mattered here too. Following animals through the forest asked for patience, sharp eyes, and steadiness. A hunter who succeeded had learned to stay composed under strain and to move fast the moment a chance opened. Those very habits carried over into fighting. Weapons training slowly became a more earnest business as boys grew older. Wooden training pieces yielded to iron blades and weightier shields. Sparring bouts built coordination along with nerve. Wrestling kept its special importance since it taught balance, strength, and resolve. More telling still, it exposed a person's character. A youth who threw in the towel at the first difficulty won little regard. One who kept his composure even in defeat often earned respect instead. The Norse honoured perseverance nearly as highly as winning. Tales, too, went into the making of future fighters. These accounts held up models of how a person ought to behave. Courage, loyalty, and honour surfaced over and over. Among them ran stories of a stranger kind of warrior, men who fought with dreadful intensity, men who appeared marked by powers past ordinary grasp, men whose very names stirred both awe and disquiet. The young listener could not yet have understood, but many held that such men drew their power from the most enigmatic god in the whole Norse world, Odin himself. For the great majority of Viking warriors, war was a matter of plain necessity. You fought because your chief called on you. You fought to shield your family, guard your land, win wealth, or resolve quarrels that talk had failed to settle. Combat was hazardous, yet it belonged to the ordinary rhythm of life. For the men who turned into berserkers, though, war meant something further down. It was spiritual. A good many scholars hold that berserkers were bound up closely with the worship of Odin, the most intricate and puzzling figure in all of Norse belief. Where Thor was plain dealing and beloved, Odin was a god woven from contradictions. His domains included wisdom and madness, poetry and death, magic and warfare, understanding and disorder. If Thor was the steady guardian everyone hoped stood near them when the storm broke, Odin was the disquieting outsider who posed awkward questions and somehow held the answer before a word was spoken. To the Vikings, Odin was more than a god of battle. He was the god who grasped the meaning of sacrifice. Norse myth tells that Odin hung himself of his own will from the world tree for 9 days and nights so as to win concealed knowledge. He gave up one of his eyes in trade for wisdom. Time and again, the tales cast him as one prepared to endure suffering in the chase for greater power. Many warriors looked on this with admiration, but certain warriors set out to copy it. These men held that by giving themselves over to Odin, they might reach some special strength, courage, or spiritual force. A number of scholars propose that berserkers may have belonged to warrior cults sworn to the god, circles that fused religious loyalty with martial preparation. Though the proof stays thin, medieval sources repeatedly tie berserkers to the sway of Odin. That tie was no accident. Odin himself was frequently linked with the frenzy of battle. He could kindle overpowering courage in the warriors he favoured, while spreading dread and confusion among their foes. Both triumph and ruin lay within his grip. This conviction coloured the way certain fighters understood combat. An ordinary warrior might dread death. A warrior given over to Odin sought to welcome it. After all, those who fell bravely could hope to pass into Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where the slain feasted, trained, and made ready for Ragnarok. For a young man reared on such tales, dying in battle could seem less fearful than slipping away quietly at rest. A quiet end offered comfort. A glorious end offered something that would not fade, and so warriors bound to Odin often nurtured fearlessness to an extreme pitch. They schooled themselves to shrug off pain, to smother hesitation, and to meet danger straight on. Yet devotion by itself did not make a berserker. To truly become one, a warrior had to pass through rituals and transformations that blurred the line dividing man, beast, and legend. A berserker was not merely a warrior who threw himself into a fight with abandon. Of those the Norse already had no shortage. The men set down in the sagas and later chronicles stood apart because they seemed remade. Onlookers told of fighters who appeared to shed ordinary human conduct in the thick of battle, slipping into a condition somewhere among religious rapture, animal rage, and utter fearlessness. Exactly how this change took hold remains one of history's lasting riddles. The Vikings left behind no handbook titled How to Become a Berserker in 7 Simple Steps. So historians are left to assemble hints from sagas, myths, and scattered mentions committed to writing ages ago. What takes shape is a portrait of warriors who went through preparation both of the mind and of the spirit. Religion very likely stood at the heart of it. A warrior hoping to earn Odin's favour may have taken part in rituals meant to deepen his bond with the god. Such rites might have drawn in prayers, offerings, chanting, or symbolic gestures intended to set him apart from ordinary society. The aim was not merely to grow stronger, the aim was to grow other. A great many warrior cultures across history have leaned on ritual to remake identity. Before setting out to fight, warriors have often carried out ceremonies that shore up courage and put down fear. The rite itself brings about a shift in the mind. It signals to the one taking part that he is no longer just a farmer, a hunter, or a fisherman. He is now a warrior. For berserkers, this reshaping may have reached much deeper. Some scholars believe they set out on purpose to bring on altered states of mind. Repeated chanting, steady drumming, fierce dancing, measured breathing, going without sleep, or long fasting have all been floated as possible means. Not one can be shown for certain. Even so, practices of this sort turn up in warrior traditions the world over and might help account for the extraordinary conduct the Norse sources describe. The sagas often show berserkers entering a fight in a state of overwhelming intensity. In the moments before combat they turned restless, agitated, and charged with feeling. Their breath came faster. Their attention drew tight. Everything beyond the fight ahead seemed to fall away. Modern psychology would spot some of these effects at once. The human body is able to undergo striking changes under extreme stress or excitement. Adrenaline can blunt pain, add to strength, and narrow sight into a single channel. Fear can dissolve beneath a surge of concentrated aggression. To Viking onlookers, however, something more profound was underway. They believed the warrior was being touched by forces outside the ordinary world. A man was turning into something else. And nowhere did this change show more plainly than in the animals with which berserkers chose to align themselves. The mighty bear and the dreaded wolf, creatures whose spirits they hoped to bear with them into battle. The remaking of a berserker did not stop at the rituals. It surfaced in appearance as well. All across the Norse world, animals carried deep symbolic weight. They were not merely creatures dwelling in the forests or ranging over the mountains. They stood for traits that people admired, feared, and now and then longed to hold within themselves. For berserkers, two animals rose above every other: the bear and the wolf. The very word berserker may descend from a phrase meaning bear shirt, pointing to warriors who went into battle wrapped in bear hides. Other elite fighters, called Urfhedna, were tied to wolves and are said to have donned wolf pelts instead. Seen through modern eyes, this might look like an odd choice of dress. To the Vikings, it carried profound meaning. The bear ranked among the most powerful animals known in Scandinavia. Huge, clever, and enormously strong, it drew respect wherever it wandered. A bear driven into a corner could be terrifying. It fought with unrelenting resolve and seemed all but impossible to cow. Those were precisely the traits a warrior wished to give off. The wolf stood for something else. Where the bear meant sheer strength, the wolf carried cunning, staying power, and coordinated aggression. Wolves hunted as a pack, chased their prey across long distances, and struck with deadly efficiency the moment a chance arose. Both beasts held a weighty place in Norse mythology. Odin himself kept strong ties to wolves. His companions, Geri and Friki, went with him throughout the myths. Wolves surfaced again and again in stories bound up with fate, battle, and destruction. By clothing themselves in animal hides, berserkers may have been doing far more than showing off trophies. They may have been taking on in symbol, the very nature of these creatures. In numerous ancient cultures, warriors held that the spirits of animals could grant strength, courage, or protection. The line between human and beast was often drawn in a way unlike how we draw it now. Through ritual, costume, and belief, a warrior could try to gather to himself the qualities of a powerful predator. The hide became more than something to wear, it became a piece of who he was. Picture standing before such a warrior on the field of battle. A warrior wrapped in bearskin, roaring his war chant, heedless of the blades around him, pressing forward as though nothing could touch him. In the end, it hardly mattered whether any otherworldly power was truly at work. The effect on the mind alone would have been enough. Fear can serve as a weapon, and few grasped this more clearly than the berserkers. When they finally closed with an enemy, what they hoped that enemy would see was not a man at all, but something closer to a storm made flesh. Untamed, unpredictable, and hazardous to approach. For before long, these fighters would have to make good on such a reputation in the service of kings and chieftains, rulers whose very survival often rested on the daring of a handful of exceptional men. Once a berserker had made his name, he was no longer merely one more body in the shield wall. He had joined a select circle. The mightiest kings and chieftains of Scandinavia kept professional warriors close about them, a band known as a herd, a personal following held together by loyalty, generosity, and shared need. These men were the fighting core of a ruler's strength, and among them the berserkers tended to hold a place apart, at least during the stretches when they were not unsettling everyone in the vicinity. Belonging to a king's household carried real rewards. A fighter might be handed treasures of genuine worth, fine weapons, good clothing, silver, and sometimes land as well. Faithful service opened doors to riches that a common farmer could scarcely picture. A king poured resources into his finest warriors without hesitation, for when foes gathered at the edge of the land, a lavish gift looked far cheaper than a lost battle. Existence within the herd turned on discipline and constant readiness. The warriors drilled side by side, journeyed with their leader, sat at his feasts, and joined his ventures abroad. Some passed years at their chieftain's side, wandering across Scandinavia and further still. The tie-binding ruler to warrior counted for a great deal. A worthy king repaid loyalty, and a worthy warrior shielded his king. Should either neglect his part, the arrangement usually came apart, and often in ugly fashion. Berserkers offered something unusual to these warbands. Their name alone could unnerve a rival. Accounts of what they had done in battle moved swiftly through Norse society, and an enemy who learned that a king's ranks held berserkers might well pause before pressing a quarrel, or at the very least give it a moment's thought. Their standing, though, arrived paired with heavy demands. A berserker was meant to lead from the very front. Once fighting broke out, no one wished to hear grumbling about foul weather, aching limbs, or a fresh fondness for peaceful talk. Warriors of this rank were expected to show remarkable nerve when the pressure mounted. Their reputation left no other option. Many sagas cast berserkers as guards, keeping rulers safe through perilous moments. Others show them as shock fighters loosed at the decisive turn of a battle. Whether every such tale holds up as history stays uncertain, yet the picture never wavers. These were men meant to be where the fighting burned hottest. The role brought honour, but it brought hazard in equal measure. Elite warriors often bore the heaviest losses, since they stood in the path of the greatest dangers. Renown and glory lay within reach, though neither offered anything resembling a comfortable retirement. Even so, plenty judged the gamble worth taking, for to a berserker, honour outweighed safety. And sooner or later every warrior had to make good on his name where it mattered most, out on the field itself, in that dreadful instant when the fabled berserker fury at last broke loose. Everything in a berserker's life pointed toward that instant. The years of training, the dedication to Odin, the rites, the animal signs, the ceaseless hunt for courage and renown. All of it was groundwork for the condition that made these men famous across the whole Norse world. The fury. By the saga's telling, a berserker did not go into battle as an ordinary fighter did. Beforehand, onlookers spoke of striking shifts in his bearing. The warrior turned restless and jittery. His breath came harder. His gaze seemed locked on something no one else could make out. Then the change took hold. The Icelandic sagas insist that berserkers fought with astonishing savagery. Some records tell of them bellowing like beasts. Others say they paid no mind to injuries that would have laid ordinary men low. Enemies, so the tales run, found them nearly impossible to frighten, while comrades tended to leave them a courteous measure of room, which was very likely a sensible choice. One saga calls berserkers as crazed as dogs or wolves. Another says they gnawed their shields before the fighting started. Whether each particular is true can never be settled, but the sameness of these descriptions hints that something out of the ordinary was indeed happening. The question is what? For hundreds of years, historians have argued over the origin of the berserker fury. A few have proposed religious rapture. Others look to intense mental conditioning. Some have floated the notion of intoxicating substances, though the proof stays thin and hotly contested. Scholars today usually lean toward answers that weave together ritual preparation, extreme emotional stirring, and the weight of cultural expectation. People, after all, can reach striking states of mind given the right conditions. Soldiers all through history have spoken of moments in combat when fear simply drained away. Pain felt remote, and time itself seemed to crawl. Adrenaline can reshape perception in dramatic ways. Training can push past hesitation. Belief can carry a person well beyond what they would normally think possible. The berserkers may have harnessed these effects more skillfully than anyone else in Viking society. And more to the point, everyone counted on them to do so. A warrior who had spent years building a name as a fearless servant of Odin could hardly draw back once battle came. His whole identity rested on matching the legend, and legends carry a power all their own. Whether the fury sprang from divine touch, from the mind, or from some blend of the two, its effect could not be denied. Tales of berserkers spread across Scandinavia and past its edges. Their reputation swelled with every retelling. Yet admiration told only half the story. For all their glory, berserkers stirred fear as well. Not among their enemies alone, but at times among their own people too. The berserker fury drew admiration. It also drew fear. In Viking society, those two rarely travelled far apart. A warrior who could hurl himself into battle without a flicker of doubt, hold his ground against hopeless odds, and terrify his foes naturally won respect. Chieftains wanted such men in their ranks. Kings prized them as guards and champions. Poets sang of their deeds in verses that might outlast whole generations. But there lay a difficulty. The very traits that made berserkers priceless in war could make them a menace in peace. Most Viking warriors knew where the line fell. They fought when they had to and returned to everyday life afterward. They farmed, they traded, they attended assemblies, raised families, and settled quarrels through familiar custom. Berserkers held a shakier position. The sagas often paint them as unpredictable figures. Some stories make them loyal heroes. Others cast them as bullies, troublemakers, or men who never quite fit within the community. In these accounts, berserkers now and then dared rivals to duels, leaned on weaker folk, or used their fearsome names to take what they wanted. Whether such stories mirror what truly happened or grew out of later embellishment is hard to say. What counts is that the reputation was there. People believed berserkers could turn dangerous, even when no battle loomed. This made for a knotty bond with the wider community. Villagers might praise a famous berserker's courage while quietly hoping he stayed a few villages off. His presence promised protection, but it could also bring strain. It was rather like keeping a guard bear, highly effective and potentially awkward. Reputation grew into one of a berserker's sharpest weapons. News moved fast across the Norse world. Traders, sailors, warriors and travellers carried stories from one settlement to the next. Every victory lifted a warrior's standing. Every account swelled a little with each retelling. Before long, fact and legend began to blur together. A warrior who came through a hard fight might turn into a man who bested 10 foes. A grim battle might become an impossible victory against crushing odds. People have always liked to polish a good story, all the more so after a few cups of mead. As these legends spread, berserkers grew larger than life. They stood for the ideal of pure fearlessness. Young warriors looked up to them. Enemies dreaded them. Poets fixed them in memory. Yet reputations, however mighty, cannot endure forever. In time, Scandinavian society began to shift. Kings drew power into fewer hands. Christianity moved across the north. Fresh laws and fresh values took root. The world that had shaped the berserkers was quietly slipping away, and the legendary warriors themselves would begin to fade into history, leaving behind one last question. What became of the berserkers once the Viking Age had ended? For hundreds of years, berserkers ranked among the most dreaded warriors in northern Europe. Kings prized them, enemies feared them, stories honored them. Yet, as the Viking Age drew to its close, the berserkers began to vanish. Not because their courage had failed them, not because they had forgotten how to fight. The world around them had changed. When most people picture the witch hunts, they imagine a shadowy village where an innocent woman is abruptly accused of soaring through the night sky on a broomstick. The truth was a good deal more tangled and a good deal more unsettling. The witch hunts did not begin because a whole population suddenly lost its reason. They rose out of a world already thick with fear, uncertainty, and real hardship. To grasp why thousands came to be accused of witchcraft, one first has to enter the lives of ordinary Europeans living between the 15th and 17th centuries. Life was hard. A harvest might fail with no warning. Sickness could sweep through a town within weeks. Livestock could perish. Children could fall ill in a single night. Storms could ruin crops that stood for an entire year of labor, and no one knew the reason. Today, we have meteorology, medicine, and science to account for many disasters. Early modern Europeans had far fewer answers to reach for. When misfortune came, people cast about desperately for explanations. Human beings sit remarkably ill at ease with pure chance. If a cow dropped dead, there had to be a cause. If a child sickened, there had to be a reason. If hail flattened one village's harvest while the neighboring fields stood untouched, someone had to be at fault. The thought that dreadful things merely happened with no purpose behind them felt deeply unsatisfying. Religion shaped these convictions as well. Europe was overwhelmingly Christian, and people saw the world through a spiritual lens. God, angels, demons, miracles, and the devil were not distant ideas. They were living forces at work in daily life. Most believed that Satan labored constantly to corrupt humankind. By the teachings of the Church, demons could tempt, deceive, and injure the faithful. If God acted through miracles, then the devil could act through witchcraft. Such, at least, was the fear. As religious tensions sharpened during the Reformation, that anxiety climbed higher still. Catholics and Protestants charged one another with spreading evil. Wars broke out. Communities split apart. Trust grew brittle. Suspicion took hold. Neighbours kept watch on neighbours. Old arguments came back to life. Long-held grudges found fresh openings. Slowly, the ideal conditions for witch hunts were falling into place. Strangely enough, many of those most terrified of witches had never once met one, for there were no organized bands of secret witches gathering in the woods to plot Europe's ruin. What existed in their place was something far more dangerous, a population shaken by hardship, certain that unseen evil lurked everywhere and desperate to find someone to blame. Once that fear had settled in, accusations came more readily than evidence. And that is precisely the point at which the witch hunts truly began. As fear spread through Europe, people set about looking for someone to blame. The question was a plain one. If witches were the source of misfortune, who were they? The answer, sadly, rested less on evidence than on suspicion. One of the largest misunderstandings about the witch hunts is the belief that every victim was an old woman living by herself in a cottage deep in the forest. Such women were indeed accused, but the truth was far more tangled. The accused came from every walk of life. Most were women, though not all. Historians reckon that roughly 3/4 of those accused across Europe were female. That still leaves thousands of men who found themselves standing before judges, trying to prove they had never sealed a pact with the devil. Witchcraft accusations followed patterns, yet they were never wholly predictable. Women were frequently singled out because of the prevailing beliefs about gender. Religious leaders and learned writers often described women as spiritually frailer, easier to tempt, and thus more open to corruption by the devil. Today, the notion seems ridiculous, yet in that era, plenty of well-schooled people treated it as ordinary common sense. Widows were particularly exposed. Lacking husbands to speak for them, they tended to hold shaky positions inside their villages. A great many lived by themselves and leaned on neighbours when times grew hard. Sadly, that reliance could turn into suspicion with unsettling ease. Should a widow ask for food and be turned away? And should a household's cow die soon afterward? A few might quietly ask whether a curse had trailed the quarrel. The human mind has always been unusually gifted at stitching together events that share no real link. Healers and folk practitioners carried the same hazard. Countless communities depended on local women who mixed herbal cures, helped mothers through childbirth, or eased everyday ailments. Most were valued right up until a case went badly. When a patient mended, the healer was thanked. When a patient died, the whispering started. The very skill that had earned confidence could turn, almost overnight, into a reason for dread. Newcomers, too, drew frequent attention. Fresh arrivals had no kin nearby and no reputation built over years. They struck people as strange. They carried themselves differently. In nervous villages, that strangeness alone was often enough to breed distrust. Even temperament could turn perilous. Those known for quarrelling, odd habits, or an inability to fit in sometimes drew notice they never wanted. A neighbour forever bickering with others might, in time, discover that every stroke of bad luck was being laid at their door. What made the hunt so bitterly sad is that so many charges grew out of nothing more than everyday human friction. Squabbles over land, family feuds, romances gone sour, rivalries in trade, plain old resentment. But the moment a charge slipped into the courts, a private grievance hardened into something far more menacing. For now the churches, the judges and the rulers were starting to treat witchcraft as a genuinely grave matter. Across many centuries, Europeans had believed in magic, in curses, in unseen powers. Yet believing in witchcraft was one thing, and mounting sweeping hunts was quite another. The true peril arose only when mighty institutions stepped in. Once churches, courts and governments began handling witchcraft as a serious crime, charges that might have stayed mere village talk could abruptly turn into questions of life and death. Oddly enough, medieval Europe had not always been fixated on chasing witches. Through much of the earlier Middle Ages, in fact, a good many church figures brushed aside tales of magical flights, hidden meetings, and supernatural gifts as silly superstition. The formal line was frequently that anyone who swallowed such stories was simply confused. That outlook shifted little by little. By the closing centuries of the Middle Ages, religious thinkers argued more and more that witches were not just misled souls, they were servants of the devil. That single shift changed the whole picture. Someone charged with folk magic was one matter. Someone charged with willingly working alongside the devil became something far more alarming. Witchcraft was no longer a small local nuisance. It became one front in a cosmic war between good and evil. The appearance of influential books helped these ideas travel. Scholars, theologians, and church officers wrote at length about the supposed threat that witches posed. They painted pictures of secret assemblies, demonic bargains, and intricate plots against Christian society. Little of this rested on any real foundation. That hardly kept people from believing it. Printing presses carried such notions across the continent far more swiftly than anything before them. Fears that had once been local now became fears held in common. Meanwhile, governments began to take notice. Local rulers fretted about keeping order. Religious strife was already pulling parts of Europe apart. Uprisings, wars, plagues, and hard times bred a mood of deep uncertainty. Leaders often viewed witch hunting as a way to show that they were shielding their people from concealed dangers. Judges grew ever readier to take up witchcraft cases. Laws were rewritten and inquiries widened. The whole legal machinery came to treat witchcraft as a crime worth prosecuting. This bred a dangerous loop. The harder the authorities looked for witches, the more accusations surfaced. The more accusations surfaced, the more people grew certain that witches truly lurked everywhere. Fear fed on fear. Each trial appeared to confirm the danger. Each confession seemed to prove the charges that came before. Before long, witch hunting gathered a momentum all its own. What had started as scattered suspicions between neighbours was swelling into something vastly larger. Powerful institutions now backed the hunt, equipped with courts, prisons, and the force of law. And once a charge slipped into that machinery, breaking free of it grew extraordinarily hard. Because the workings of a witch trial were often built to establish guilt rather than to uncover the truth. Once a charge of witchcraft was laid, matters could move with startling speed. A thoughtless word, a dead cow, a ruined harvest, a spat between neighbours, any one of these might stir suspicion. And once suspicion hardened into a formal charge, the accused entered a process that was usually tilted heavily against them from the outset. Despite what many assume, witch trials were not the same everywhere. Europe was carved into hundreds of separate jurisdictions, each with its own laws, its own customs, its own courts. Some regions chased witchcraft fiercely. Others stayed markedly more doubtful. Whether the accused survived often hinged less on the evidence than on where they happened to live, a rather unlucky detail if you were the one accused. The process generally began when someone reported troubling behavior. A neighbor might claim a curse had followed an argument. A farmer might blame a lost crop on witchcraft. A family might sense supernatural mischief after a sudden death. To readers now, such charges often sound ridiculous. To those alive then, they could feel entirely believable. Once the authorities got involved, investigators collected accounts from witnesses. They questioned neighbors, relatives, and anyone who might know something about the accused. This was seldom a good sign. People are remarkably good at recalling odd moments once they have already decided that someone is guilty. All at once, every strange remark looked suspicious. Every past disagreement took on fresh weight. Every coincidence gathered supernatural meaning. If a woman had quarrelled with a neighbour years before, and that neighbour later met with misfortune, the tale might be offered up as evidence. Not proof, evidence. The difference mattered. Sadly, it was not always honoured. Investigators frequently hunted for physical signs thought to be tied to witchcraft. Some held that witches bore special marks left on them by the devil. Examinations were carried out in the hope of turning up odd scars, birthmarks, or blemishes. Since nearly every person carries some sort of scar, mole, or flaw, these searches tended to yield precisely what the investigators were expecting. A remarkable coincidence. The accused were often jailed while they waited for trial. Conditions could be grim. Isolation, fear, uncertainty, and the hostility of the public built enormous mental strain. All the while, rumours kept spreading through the community. People talked over the case. Guesswork multiplied. Witnesses stepped forward. Some gave honest testimony. Others merely passed along gossip they had picked up second-hand. The boundary between fact and rumour slowly dissolved, and that was perhaps the deepest danger of all. Because once enough people had grown sure of someone's guilt, the trial often drifted away from asking whether the accused was truly a witch. Instead, it turned toward wringing out a confession. And that is where the witch hunts entered their bleakest chapter. The witch hunts reached their most perilous stage when the authorities became convinced that a confession was the surest proof of guilt. The trouble, naturally, was that people will confess to nearly anything given the right circumstances. And witch hunting courts grew remarkably practiced at manufacturing those circumstances. Not every corner of Europe allowed torture. Some courts were considerably more careful than others. But in places where the hunts burned especially hot, torture often sat at the heart of the inquiry. The authorities held that witches served the devil, and if witches served the devil, they reasoned, then witches would naturally lie to save themselves. This set up a troubling bind. A denial of guilt could be read as a mark of innocence, or as proof that the accused was lying. It is not hard to guess which reading was usually favoured. The accused often arrived in prison already afraid, cut off, and unsure of what lay ahead. They stood before judges who took the existence of witches for granted, witnesses who echoed rumours, and communities that expected convictions. Under such pressure, holding out against the charges grew extraordinarily hard. Then came the questioning. Some suspects faced endless interrogation meant to trick them into contradictions. Others met sleep deprivation, threats, or physical torture. European legal systems generally demanded a confession before a conviction, yet the means used to draw those confessions tended to guarantee that one arrived sooner or later. Human endurance has its limits. Pain has a striking way of making impossible tales sound reasonable. Faced with unbearable agony, many of the accused admitted to deeds they had never done. They confessed to soaring through the night, to attending hidden gatherings, to sealing pacts with demons, or to laying curses on neighbours. The particulars, often mirrored whatever the interrogators expected to hear. A suspect quickly learned which answers pleased the court. The upshot was a strange and sorrowful loop. The authorities held up confessions as evidence that witches were real. Those confessions spurred still more inquiries. Fresh suspects were seized. Each new confession seemed to bear out the one before it. The system fed on itself. False testimony grew into a serious problem as well. Children accused adults, neighbors accused neighbors. Relatives now and then testified against their own kin. Some witnesses truly believed what they said. Others were driven by fear, by revenge, or by the urge to save themselves. Once a charge rippled through a community, suspicion could spread like a contagion. Nobody wished to seem sympathetic toward a suspected witch. To do so risked drawing suspicion onto yourself. Perhaps the most sorrowful part of the witch hunts is that many of these confessions survive in written records to this day. Reading them, historians tend to see not proof of witchcraft, but proof of human desperation. People saying whatever they hoped might bring their suffering to an end. Yet rather than quieting the panic, these confessions helped drive the witch hunts toward their most ruinous phase. The great frenzy of the hunts had only just begun. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the witch hunts had swollen far past scattered accusations. What had once been a local squabble between neighbors was turning into a sweeping social panic. Whole communities grew convinced that witches were everywhere. And once people set out looking for witches, they found them. Or at least they were sure they did. This was the stretch when the witch hunts hit their high point. Across parts of Europe, and above all within the fragmented states of the Holy Roman Empire, large-scale inquiries began rolling through towns and villages. Courts arrested suspects by the dozen. Some inquiries kept widening until hundreds of people had fallen under suspicion. The panic often unfolded along a familiar course. The authorities arrested a suspected witch. Under questioning, the accused confessed and named accomplices. Those accomplices were arrested. They, in turn, confessed and named still others. Before long, the roster of suspects outgrew anyone's ability to check it. The process was like a snowball tumbling downhill. Every confession bred new accusations. Every accusation bred new fear. Every fear encouraged still more inquiries. Communities found themselves caught in a cycle that seemed impossible to halt. One of the most frightening features of these panics was how fast social trust fell apart. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades suddenly eyed one another warily. Families worried over their own relatives. Friends began to question friends. The ordinary bonds that held a community together started to fray. Picture living in a village where any careless word might be repeated before a magistrate, where a private quarrel could become an accusation, where a rumor might wreck a reputation in a single night. Many people learned that silence felt safer than candor. The panic spared few ranks of society. Poor farmers were accused, wealthy landowners were accused, craftsmen, merchants, priests, and local officials all came under suspicion in certain regions. Once the fear picked up speed, standing in society offered no sure shield. In some places, whole webs of imaginary witches took shape through forced confessions. The authorities became convinced they had exposed vast conspiracies reaching across many towns and villages. The irony was crushing. The harder the investigators dug for proof of organized witchcraft, the more they conjured the illusion that such organizations were real. Confessions produced names, names produced arrests, arrests produced further confessions. The cycle rolled on. Yet even at the crest of the panic, not everyone swallowed these claims. They asked whether people who had done nothing wrong were being sentenced to death. In the beginning, such voices were few. Yet as the years passed, that doubt grew heavier. In time, it would help draw one of history's saddest waves of panic to a close. For over 100 years, the pursuit of witches had appeared impossible to stop. The accused numbered in the thousands. The confessions numbered in the thousands. The dead numbered in the thousands. And still, as the 17th century drew toward its end, something striking took shape. People began to ask questions, not about witches, but about the hunts themselves. This shift did not arrive suddenly. There was no single day when Europe as a whole decided it had made a dreadful error. Instead, doubt spread little by little, one magistrate, one thinker, and one trial at a time. In a sense, the hunts had undone themselves through their own reach. The charges had grown too vast, too strange, and too hard to accept. Certain inquiries claimed that whole villages were riddled with witches. Others described plots said to involve dozens or even hundreds of people. Confessions spoke of things that could not happen, of journeys beyond nature, and of gatherings attended by immense crowds. At some point, even the faithful began to waver. The tale had simply grown too far-fetched. Magistrates observed another disturbing pattern. Confessions drawn out under pressure often failed to agree with one another. Witnesses revised what they had said. Charges travelled through gossip rather than through proof. Cases that looked persuasive early on tended to collapse when examined more carefully. Some courts started to insist on firmer proof. This was a pivotal turn. For generations, mere suspicion had frequently been enough to launch an investigation. Now, tribunals more and more demanded genuine evidence. And evidence, to the misfortune of the witch hunters, proved far harder to gather than rumour. During the same period, the life of the mind in Europe was shifting as well. The scientific revolution urged people to look for natural reasons behind events that earlier generations might have blamed on unseen forces. Scholars examined the stars, the workings of the body, the laws of motion, and the nature of living things with rising assurance. A ruined harvest no longer called for a witch. An outbreak of illness no longer demanded a curse. Nature alone could account for such things. Religious figures grew warier too. Some among the clergy feared that the innocent were being condemned. Others worried that runaway witch hunting was eroding the standing of the church itself. Governments, for their part, increasingly saw sweeping witch panics as dangers to public order. Officials who had once urged investigations now started to hold them back. Statutes were rewritten. The bar for evidence was lifted. The use of pressure to extract confessions was curtailed and in some places done away with altogether. Without it, mass confessions grew far less common. Without confessions, large hunts could no longer keep themselves going. Bit by bit, the panic ebbed away. Not because belief in magic vanished overnight, but because more and more people came to see that fear made a poor stand-in for proof. And once that understanding took hold, one of history's bleakest chapters slowly drew to a close. When people picture the witch hunts now, they tend to imagine a tidy tale. Uneducated people believed in witches. The innocent suffered. In the end, reason won out. There is a grain of truth in that summary, but the record shows a far more tangled and troubling reality. The hunts were not powered by ignorance alone. Many of the judges, scholars, priests, and officials involved were learned by the measures of their day. They could read Latin, study theology, argue points of law, and run intricate institutions. A number of them sincerely believed they were shielding society. That is among the most unsettling lessons the past has to give. Grave injustices are not always the work of plainly wicked people. At times they are carried out by ordinary individuals, certain they are doing what is right. Modern historians have spent decades poring over surviving court records, letters, and legal papers. These materials show that the witch hunts differed enormously from one place to the next. Some regions endured crushing surges of accusation. Others held very few trials at all. Some judges chased suspects relentlessly. Others stood against the panic and threw out weak cases. Human choices carried weight. The witch hunts were never bound to happen. Historians have also picked apart many familiar myths. Despite what many assume, most executions for witchcraft did not take place in the Middle Ages. The greatest hunts belong to the early modern era, above all across the 16th and 17th centuries. In the same way, not every victim was a healer, a midwife, or a wise woman. Many were ordinary people swept up in extraordinary circumstances. Some were singled out for being outsiders, others because they were disliked. Still others simply found themselves caught in communities overtaken by fear. Perhaps the most important insight is that the witch hunts tell us less about witches and more about people. They show how fear spreads, how rumor grows, how communities behave in uncertain times, how readily suspicion can stand in for evidence. The victims came from varied backgrounds, faiths, and social ranks, yet they shared one tragic trait. They lived in societies that had grown convinced a hidden danger was among them. And once that conviction took root, facts struggled to hold their ground against fear. That lesson still speaks to us. Technology has changed. Governments have changed. The world has changed. Human nature has not changed nearly as much as we sometimes prefer to think. The witch hunts remind us that fear can be catching, that certainty can be perilous, and that extraordinary claims call for extraordinary proof. Above all, they remind us of the price a society pays when it stops asking hard questions and begins accepting accusations without proof. The witch hunts ended long ago. The prisons are gone. The trials are finished. The places of execution fell silent generations back. And yet the legacy of the witch hunts remains surprisingly powerful.